in our summer. So I want to thank you all for joining. Welcome to CSUPERB's Prepare for Fall webinar. We're going to go ahead and record this, and we will post this later. If you have any questions, you can go back to it. My name is Bianca Mote. I am the Interim Executive Director for CSUPERB. I have two colleagues on here today that will be joining me to present on this webinar. I have Aparna Srinivasan, and Christine Valdez, both from Cal State Monterey Bay. So Aparna is an Associate Professor of Genetics and Molecular Biology. She's on our Faculty Consensus Group and Strategic Planning Council, which are two of our leadership groups for faculty. And the Strategic Planning Council is composed of faculty and deans. And she's a leader in our CSUPERB Cures Network. She's also a longtime member of the Genomics Education Partnership. And at CSUMB, she was a recipient of the UROC Mentor Award and also received the Alan S. Griffin Award for Excellence in Teaching. Christine Valdez is also joining us. She is from psychology. She's an assistant professor in psychology at Cal State Monterey Bay. I was able to engage with her after she presented on a Chancellor's Office webinar early June. And her topic is really of importance during this COVID-19 pandemic, so I'm really grateful she can be on as well. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and give you a little bit of an overview of CSUPERB. For those of you that are new to the CSU, welcome. Okay, so CSUPERB really originated as a workforce development as well as gathering place for students and faculty to come together. On the CSU campuses, we have over 1,100 CSU employees that are involved in biotech relevant education and research. And our goal is to come together around this shared interest. So we are an affinity group. We share and improve professionally, so lots of professional development and lots of community building with a focus on inquiry and action. So how can we best prepare our students to transition from the CSU onto their next phase, whether that be graduate school, medical school, or workforce. And it's really been in evolution. I'm really fortunate and honored to be helping right now. This group got together based on some faculty that talked about the subject back in 1985. Since then, there's been legislation that was put in place to help support CSUPERB. And in 2020, over $14 million has been awarded to faculty and students in biotech-related efforts. And that has returned $97 million to the CSU. We are a group that has grants and distributes grants to faculty and students. We build community, so we have several meetings throughout the year, both for our leadership group as well as opportunities to engage in this way. And we have our highlight event, which is the symposium that happens every January in 2021 that will be virtual. So we're hoping to see you all there in this virtual meeting. And to transition, really, this came about in response to some feedback that we received in a COVID-19 pandemic survey that we distributed to our faculty and students. And we realized that it would be great to have a Prepare for Fall webinar with some input from the President's Commission as well. So these are data from Education Trust West. They surveyed over 1,000 college students nationally, as well as over 300 students here in California that are engaged in higher education institutions, not just CSU. And as you are aware, right, coronavirus pandemic has been extremely disruptive terms of financial insecurity, mental health perspective. And in general, students are supportive of their institution's response to the pandemic, but there are key areas of improvement. Most students are planning on returning this fall, but they need more support than before. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then nationwide, this uncertainty and sense of disconnection. So we're hoping we can address some of those points that came up in the key findings. The mental health crisis for California students, in those that surveyed, 67% of them report higher stress than usual. The students are calling for improvements in remote learning to continue in the fall, and especially around 51% of them talked about instruction and course quality and the ability to have additional tools or study tools. I'm particularly concerned about our underserved and students of color in this pandemic, and we saw some of that when we had our own CSUPERB COVID-19 survey, where faculty were talking about students that are disengaging. In terms of students responding and being able to connect to virtual office hours or other ways to connect to faculty, nationwide, 53% of students said that they were able to continue to engage. But when you disaggregate some of those student groups, it was only 43% of the Latinx students. And then beyond, our goal here is to talk about this in the faculty context, but academic support and academic advisors were also 50% nationwide were able to engage with them, but only 39% of Black students were able to have any substantial engagement. So here at CSUPERB, we have developed a COVID-19 online community. So if you would like to engage, we are meeting once a month. And some people have said it's a great opportunity to share what's happening on their campus. And it really is just an opportunity to vent and talk. So we have our online community. If you would like to join, go ahead and email me. If you want to just stay connected to CSUPERB and see what the updates are, we do have a newsletter that goes out the 4th Friday of every month. And you can sign up for that newsletter through our website. So at this point, I want to hand this over to Christine, and thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about trauma and the mental health effects, potential mental health effects on our students. I'm a clinical psychologist in the Department of Psychology at CSU Monterey Bay. And so I'm happy to be here and share a little bit about a course I taught this summer that was focused on trauma loss and growth. And I have some data so that you could see how students have been impacted and a little bit about how this has been a trauma for some students. So we can flip over to the next slide. Okay, so I just have this slide up because I want to kind of contextualize what's going on right now, the COVID-19 pandemic, as a psychological trauma. From a mental health standpoint, a psychological trauma is defined as a direct or indirect experience of actual or threatened death, injury, or violence. And in the case of COVID-19, you can think of this as a direct experience of the threat to one's life if, for example, one has contracted the virus, or or experienced medical trauma where they've been hospitalized for weeks, for example. Indirectly, it has also been experienced as a trauma in so much as people are continually being exposed to mass injury and death through the media, or also learning of family members or loved ones who've contracted the virus. And then also this constant kind of looming threat that one could become ill, especially as cases continue to rise. And so with this in the backdrop, I just want us to all kind of think about how students, everybody really is experiencing a psychological trauma right now, though some people have this, experience this differently, I guess I should say. Okay, so we could go to the next slide. So in response to trauma, psychological trauma, a lot of times we have to consider the loss and grief that ensues. I put over here Maslow's hierarchy of needs because I think it's helpful to identify what are some of the losses that students in particular are experiencing. If you've ever taken a Psych 101 course, you might have remembered Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but there's this idea that if one wants to be kind of like the best person they can, they have to have their needs met on various levels, starting with those very basic needs, which are physiological and safety. And then moving up that hierarchy, that triangle in this picture, you could see that those next needs are psychological. And then finally at that top part of the triangle is the self-fulfillment needs, which allows one to fully self-actualize. And so right now, it's important to consider what students are going through, what they've lost in response to this pandemic, and how their needs might be frustrated right now in a way that is a barrier to their learning right now. So in terms of basic needs, what students might be going through is the loss of food security, housing, employment, stability, and predictability, because things just keep changing. Life is pretty uncertain right now. And that leads to the loss of a very, very basic sense of safety. Now moving up to those psychological needs, in response to things that have shifted, things that have shifted in the spring with going to the online learning and students moving home. A lot of students I've heard say they've lost their motivation, momentum. They've lost their social support, the college community. They've made friends at school. They've connected with their professors. And that was all lost like in the matter of days and weeks. In some cases, some students have lost loved ones to the virus. And then in some cases, they've lost a sense of accomplishment. A lot of students didn't get the opportunity to have a formal graduation ceremony. And then in terms of self-fulfillment needs at the very top of that triangle, you have to think, well, they've lost their opportunity for in-person learning, which a lot of students thrive off of. And in that way, they've lost a sense of agency over their education. Okay, and so again, this might be an important framework to think about when you're considering what students might be going through right now. And that, again, at the very basic needs level, if they're not able to have some safety around their, financial status, their food security, they might have a much more difficult time of really learning right now. All right, so we go to the next slide. When the pandemic first started happening, there was some literature that came out. There was this rapid review of the evidence in the Lancet that looked at the effects of quarantine on individuals. They reviewed a bunch of literature and found that in response to the quarantine, a lot of people might experience post-traumatic stress, confusion, and anger. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes about how this might look like in students. But it's just important to think about, yes, mental health is a significant factor during this time. In response to the pandemic or the quarantine, some of the stressors that might aggravate their mental health might be longer quarantine duration, which, as we all know, has been happening for a pretty long time already. Infection fears, which continue to rise, especially with the cases in California. You could see on the bottom left-hand corner, I did a screenshot of the cases over the last few months, and you could see like in March, compared to now, a lot less, and then those just continue to rise. And so students might be really fearful of contracting the virus, and we don't know what the future holds, but as schools start opening up, as things start opening up, I think there's going to be more fears around infection. Also frustration, boredom. So students are coming off of summer in quarantine, and I can only imagine how bored they might be. I mean, I'm extremely bored, but students might be feeling that too as they enter the fall semester. Inadequate supplies, inadequate information, financial loss, and stigma might also frustrate their mental health right now. You could see on the bottom right-hand corner, there's a screenshot of unemployment rates. Again, you could see October, January, leading up into March was fairly stable. And then boom, when the pandemic hit in March, there was just a significant uprise, and that's continuing to now. So a lot of students might be struggling with worrying about finances. Okay, we could go to the next slide. I put this slide in case anybody's interested in learning more about mental health in response to COVID-19 or other natural types of disasters. There's a special issue in both the Journal of Traumatic Stress and the journal, it's the APA journal, Psychological Trauma. And both of these have open access articles right now about mental health effects on individuals in response to what's going on. So the links are there if you're interested. So what the literature does say is that a lot of what's going to be happening for individuals, if it isn't already happening now, is that people might be or will be experiencing post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with those constructs, I put in some definitions of what that actually is in terms of symptoms. So post-traumatic stress is experienced in the form of nightmares or intrusive thoughts about trauma, again, like memories or thoughts of something really bad happening or popping up into someone's head when they don't want them to be there. Avoiding reminders of trauma, and that involves avoiding internal experiences like feelings, thoughts, as well as external experiences and objects, places, people, situations. Being hypervigilant or hyper-startled, feeling numb or detached from one's emotions, or having difficulty regulating one's emotions. Depression is experienced in the form of anhedonia, which is little interest or pleasure in doing things or feeling down or depressed. And then anxiety might be experienced in the form of like having uncontrollable worry or anxiety, feeling on edge. Sorry, I think that's my phone. Let me just mute that really quick. All right, so sorry about that. All right, so I last was talking about the symptoms that might come up in response to the current pandemic. So again, if you're unfamiliar with these are the symptoms, but again, I'll talk more about what this might look like with students in particular in just a moment. On the next slide, there's current census data that was, I think it was released in April or May, and it showed what currently the US in terms of mental health looks like. So you could see that a third of people right now are experiencing either depression or anxiety, mostly depression, and then there is a significant amount of people who are experiencing anxiety as well. And this is very significant. So I would say on average, less than 10% of the population experiences these symptoms. So this is up a significant amount. And again, we'll see what this looks like in the future, but it might be that more and more people are going to be experiencing these mental health effects. Okay, so this is a slide where I promised I'll talk about how students might be impacted. So some of you might have seen this in the spring or in the summer if you were teaching courses. For those of you who didn't notice this or weren't teaching in the summer, these are some things to look out for in the fall. One of those things might be where students are having a hard time concentrating, and that could be due to having difficulty sleeping, again, having intrusive thoughts, or really not being able to focus on what's going on because they're so worried about those basic needs, or worried about loved ones, or worried about not being able to pay their bills. So this might look like longer time to complete assignments, losing track of due dates, looking withdrawn during class meetings, especially if you're doing them virtually. In terms of sleep disturbance, what might be happening in the background, you might see students having challenges maintaining consistent schedules. So if you have meetings, class meeting times, you might see that they're not attending or they're not coming to class on time. And in terms of the loss of interest, which is called anhedonia, they might not be completing their assignments. They might be not as engaged in their assignments or engaged in group work, things like that. And then the negative affect that might be experienced, which are things like angry, guilty, blaming. they might be very pessimistic about their education, and that potentially could be directed at you, right? Because it's hard to direct it anywhere else. So if they're in front of you, or if they have contact with you through email or through assignments, you might kind of get those undertones. But again, it's really not about us, it's about what's going on right now. And one of the other symptoms, feeling distant or cut off from other people, that might look like being quiet during class time, being quiet during group work, not participating in class activities or discussions. They might just seem very withdrawn. And I think that was mentioned earlier in the webinar that students are looking pretty withdrawn right now. All right, so on the next slide, I want to introduce this idea of trauma-informed pedagogy to help students, or to help support students right now and respond to the experiences of trauma that might be happening in their lives. If you haven't heard of this concept before, it's the understanding of how trauma can affect student behaviors and responses within the school context, and the promotion of students' abilities to self-monitor and maintain positive engagement in all aspects of learning and interactions. So at the very core of this, one has to recognize trauma in terms of what that might look like in students, which we just covered, and an understanding that if students are experiencing trauma, it's likely that their brains are in survival mode right now. So they're not going to be able to focus on learning. They're going to be focusing on surviving, right? They have to adapt to survive, and that fight, freeze system is getting activated. So to calm that down, to calm their nervous system down, as teachers, what we can do is provide a sense of safety, trust, power to control, esteem, and intimacy to help support their moving up to that self-actualization ladder, right? To help support those basic and psychological needs so that they're able to learn at their best right now. And I think it's also important to pay attention to cultural, historical, and gender issues right now, especially in the current kind of political climate with what's going on in our society. And so here I just wrote down some things that we could do as teachers to support them in these areas. So for example, for power and control, we can empower voice and choice by identifying and helping build on students' strengths. For safety, we can kind of ensure their emotional, cognitive, physical, and interpersonal safety. And that doesn't mean like you have to be their therapist. That just means, checking in and modeling to them how to kind of cope right now. All right, so on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about a course I taught in the summer, and it was called Trauma, Loss, and Growth During COVID-19. I decided to teach this course. It was a special topics course that's not on the books or anything. I just decided to teach this probably in April. We got it on the books really quick, and it ran in June, for the month of June. And it was really in response to providing an opportunity for students to learn about the psychological effects of this pandemic and how best to support other people as well as themselves. So they did a lot of activities around developing coping skills, developing resiliency, so that, again, they could sort of help themselves, but model to other people positive coping. So it was really an opportunity to increase safety, connectedness, and hope via the course readings and discussions, and then increase resilience and mitigate potential distress via skill building activities. And what I was concerned with was, again, providing the content, but also the process was going to be focused on these 4 core priorities for trauma-informed distance learning, because it was done virtually in a month. And so I really wanted to provide some predictability, structured flexibility, connection, and empowerment. And if you're interested, there's a link to that article on the 4 core priorities, so you can read more about what that looks like. But in terms of my class, predictability was in the form of having consistent due dates and times for assignments. So every week on the same day at the same time, all their assignments were due for that week, so that they could keep track of just one due date and get it all in. And they could do it on their own time, but they had to have it in on that day at that time. The structured flexibility part was, I didn't have any mandatory class meetings. I recorded mini lectures and posted those. So again, they can watch those at any time and respond to them. And that was in the case that they were, working odd hours, or they had children at home, or they just could not make certain class times. So I didn't want them to be stressed out about that. The lectures were there, they watched them when they had the opportunity to, and then they completed their assignments and turned them in at the same day, time every week. And then to provide some sense of connection, since it was a virtual experience, I didn't want them to feel like they were in these silos by themselves, just learning information. So I hosted a weekly coffee hour via Zoom, and it wasn't mandatory. I offered it for extra credit so that students didn't feel like they had to make it, but that if they wanted to make it, they could be there. And really, it was just an opportunity to check in with people. We didn't really focus on course content. Unless students had questions, I was there to answer those questions, but it was really an opportunity to check in, see how everyone was doing. And as things were unfolding with the pandemic, we just kind of talked about it. So it was really like a support system for them. And then lastly, for empowerment, I tried to share decision-making and give them some authentic voice. And to do that, again, they're the ones who decided what time the coffee hour was. We took a poll and it was chosen based on the most people that could attend. And in terms of like the final assignment, there was a particular assignment that all of them had to do, but they got to decide not how they did it, but it was a cover letter that they had to write, and they got to decide what job they would be applying to. And so there was some kind of authentic voice in that experience. On the next slide, I'm going to introduce some data about how students' mental health throughout this course. At the beginning of the course, I surveyed the students using self-report questionnaires, and they responded to items that assess post-traumatic stress and then post-traumatic growth, which is essentially positive experiences or benefits that have resulted from going through a trauma. So the post-traumatic growth inventory, positive beliefs or positive benefits scale, and stress-related growth inventory all assess post-traumatic growth or positive benefits. And you can see that at the beginning, there was 20 students enrolled in the course, 19 students took the survey, and then at the end of the course, 17 took it. So there was some attrition. Not a large sample size. It's also not a long time period to do a pre-post assessment, but it was what I was working with. So it was more of just like curiosity. I wanted to know what students were experiencing. So you could see that there wasn't like significant large shifts in the items on the graph at the right. I'm going to point out the PCL5, which is the post-traumatic stress scale, and that assesses post-traumatic stress symptoms. And you could see that was probably the most significant shift. It shifted 5 points, which is actually clinically significant. So you could see that students were experiencing a moderate degree of post-traumatic stress. A score of 33 on this measure suggests that someone has PTSD. So they were scoring around 26, which is, it's not clinically significant, but it's moderate. Like that's concerning. And then you could see that they shifted down by the end of the semester, or the 1 month semester, 5 points. And then in terms of post-traumatic growth and positive benefits, there was a shift up, which is good, which that suggests they were starting to identify some positive benefits they were experiencing as a result of going through this trauma. And those positive benefits are things like having more of a sense of agency, having more connection with others, reprioritizing one's life. However, that last line, the stress-related growth inventory, which is that green line, actually went down. And that to me suggests that students weren't able to grow just yet in response to their current stress, because the pandemic is still going on. So I imagine that students are still going through it. You know, those basic needs are still getting frustrated. So they're just not able to grow just yet from that experience. So it would be interesting to survey them again, like 6 months after the class or maybe a year after the class, but within a month, there's some shift in this data. And so I think it's pretty interesting that, and hopeful that students were having a decrease in their post-traumatic stress by doing some of the skill building activities. On the last slide, I just wanted to introduce what students actually said about this course to demonstrate how that course structure, the predictability, flexibility, et cetera, helps support students. So in terms of predictability, one student said, from the first day of class, we knew what was expected of us and when all assignments would be due. The workload was doable, however, online school is not my strong suit. So again, here a student saying like, I don't like online school, I don't like this virtual learning, but I can do it if I have structure to do it and I know what's expected of me. In terms of flexibility, one student wrote she was open with availability. We once had a Zoom meeting while she was with her baby, but made time for me since I was only available at that specific hour. So I just had a baby in April and I was running this course in June. And with a newborn, as you probably know, for those of you who have kids, you don't have a lot of me time. And so I intentionally was trying to model to my students that like, I'm doing this too. I'm in this with you. Like, this is not easy for me. We're all in this together and we'll get through it. And so I intentionally did meet with a student while I was holding my baby to model like, hey, we're just gonna get through this. And even during the coffee hours, I was holding my baby to model that like, I'm another human being. This sucks, but we're doing it together and we're gonna do it. And then connection, students said that they really enjoyed the coffee hours. Again, it wasn't mandatory. Students were offered extra credit as an incentive to join, but I would say about half of students joined at least one coffee hour. I offered 4 through the month every Friday, and I would say about half of students came to at least one of those. And then empowerment, one student said her class was a safe space for all. So again, I wanted to create that safe space so that students felt that sense of agency and control over their lives and what was going on with them as much as possible. And so again, it seemed to help students learn in this class. So that's it. Happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you for allowing me to present here.
Thank you. I see there were a couple of questions and we'll try to get to those at the end. I am going to switch it over to Aparna. And thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That was really interesting. I'm going to switch gears just slightly and talk to you about some anecdotal evidence that I have realized over the time of starting with sheltering in place in late spring and then teaching a course over the summer and some changes I'm going to make for fall. I'm also going to provide you with some survey data that our Undergraduate Research Opportunities Center and Office of Inclusive Excellence have put together. They conducted a survey in the spring of students, and it's really nice the way this is going to dovetail with Christine's talk. Next slide, please. So I'll just introduce you to my style. My philosophy is that I have a very classic lecture style. I use PowerPoint very sparingly just to augment the images that I draw on the board. I have daily problem sets in my courses. So I teach genetics and molecular biology. And so those courses require problem sets. Students are encouraged to have a voice in my class. I like them to question me. I like them to ask as many questions as possible. And I also use the Socratic method quite a bit. I'm open to personal discussions. When we're on campus, it's really easy to do that. I have a couch in my office. My door is always open, but now this proves to be a little bit more of a challenge. I'll tell you how I'm trying to approach that. And I believe that a safe classroom environment, as Christine just mentioned as well, with our students feeling comfortable and safe. Next slide, please. So the course I'm going to talk to you about is my advanced cell biology course. In the spring, I was teaching 3 courses. The research course ground to a halt, basically. That's a wet lab course. The honors capstone course was very easy to move into the online modality because it was basically working on putting together posters, etc., and writing with students. The advanced cell biology course is a lecture-based course with 3 exams. Students write a literature review. They all do journal club presentations and have problem sets. So I'll discuss how each of those went during the course of that rapid change. Next slide, please. So the initial setup when I came home after that first week of trying to figure things out is that I had a computer camera. The computer camera was projecting onto a whiteboard here behind me. Now, the problem with that was that the computer camera was not adequate to project properly onto that whiteboard. So first of all, students couldn't see me well. I couldn't see the students well. The recordings and the images were not good. And my desk was really low at the time. So I was bending up and down and back and forth. And so rather than mimicking what I was hoping to be an actual classroom environment, it did not work well. Luckily, I have upper division students, so I was able to ask them after every class period, how did that go? What would you have liked to see better? And so that led to some improvement during the course of the semester. Next slide, please. So the journal club I talked about for that class, usually the students meet with me one time before the journal club, and it's a very intricate journal club where students actually have to present about all of the authors in the article, about the actual journal itself, and investigate what that journal is about, the impact factor, etc. And so this time I increased the meeting time to 2 one-hour blocks with each group of students so that they could go over the journal club and feel very comfortable with their presentation. The students just shared their screens. Everyone was required to have their camera on unless they had some kind of issue. And we did this once a week for an hour. Also, all of the observers are required to ask substantive questions which engaged the group. This is how it usually is, and it worked very well in the online format as well. Next slide, please. So then in the middle of the spring iteration, I changed the way that I was doing things and added a tablet. Instead of projecting onto the whiteboard, I used a tablet to write on. Now, the problem with this was then I was sitting. That was not ergonomically correct for me. The tablet was way too small, so I was writing so big that I had to switch pages every couple of seconds almost, and that wasn't good for the students. They weren't able to really see, especially for a class like advanced cell biology, it was very difficult for them to follow along. And the tablet pen I had kept cutting out, so then we had to stop and then I would plug it in. And so, but the pros for this is you can display PowerPoint images and write on top of them if you use them, and it's recordable. But still the students didn't like the way that that worked either. Please, next slide. The exams. I made all of the exams open book and open note because I figured why worry about students looking at their notes anyway? And so I figured let's just do it that. However, I aimed the exams the same. So they were still 2 hours. So they had their notes, hopefully to alleviate some anxiety, but then they also were timed just like they would be normally. And again, I'll iterate that this is an upper division 400 level class. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of maintaining that rigor for the students. And then I put each student into their own breakout room during the exam. So that way they had their own quiet space so that if they had a question, they could bring me into the breakout room and we wouldn't disturb anybody else while they were taking the exam. And the result was that the students did about the same as they did before COVID-19, even with their notes in book available. But I do think that it may have given them a little more peace of mind. Next slide, please. Okay, and so my office hours, I offered 3 times many office hours as I do, spanning multiple time periods for students that may be working, may have been disrupted by family members or children, etc. And so I offered them spanning different times of the day, earlier in the morning, later in the evening. And I held 2 review sessions per exam instead of 1, so that to enable students to be able to interact with me at that level as well, in case they had other things that were distracting them. Next slide, please. And what did I learn? So neither of the formats that I used for lecture worked during the spring lecture course. And, but I did learn that I need to improve student engagement. I think that any students that are able should have their cameras on. That actually helps me too. And what I talked to them about was that, if and when we go back, you're gonna walk by my office and you will know who I am, but I won't know who you are. And that might be deflating for you if I don't know what your face looks like, right? And so that was one of my excuses, but also it's better for me for my engagement if I'm able to see people's faces. Right now I'm looking at people's faces while I'm talking to you, and it really helps. It makes me feel more engaged, like a part of a group. Now I have new ways to hold evening office hours. I have children. Usually I don't stay on campus past 5 o'clock, but this way, even after SIP lifts, I think I'm going to offer online office hours in the evenings for my students so that they can actually attend sometimes. I think that students need much more instructor time during distance learning and emotional support, just as being mentioned. I found that if I stayed back after the Zoom ended, that students would stay back and they would start talking to me about things that were bothering them or something that had happened. And that was really helpful because it made me feel like I was back in my office on that couch with them again. And providing students with an open note exam eased anxiety, but I'm curious to know if it affects the retention of their knowledge of this work. And so I want to develop a few surveys to assess this question. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to shift into my summer course. I teach it every summer. It's an accelerated genetics course. It's, excuse me, it's 3 weeks long, Mondays through Fridays, 8 to 12 and 2 to 4. It usually has a really high pass rate because students are just doing this 24/7. And it has 2 student tutors and is capped at 24, which I found to be a relatively decent size even for online learning. And then 3 exams and problem sets. Office hours are always daily, and the tutors provide problem-solving sessions and exam reviews. Next slide. So the first thing I did was I changed my workstation. I got myself a stand-up desk, which really helped in terms of ergonomics for myself, but also so that I could walk back and forth, almost mimicking the same kind of style I have in the classroom. I also, as you notice, got a webcam, which really helped because then I could engage with the webcam while I was giving my lecture, but then also see my students on my screen. And so this really helped a lot in terms of the video quality and as well as really just trying to mimic what the classroom looked like. Next slide, please. And so another thing that I added is that I survey my students before the first class period. So in this sense, where I put them into groups for the problem solving sessions. So I asked them questions like, please describe your study habits. How would you describe your personality? Do you prefer to study alone or in groups, and how do you study? In this way, I was able to then put students in sort of like-minded students in groups together, hopefully allowing for a better interaction while they were studying, and maybe to meet somebody new that they could interact with. Next slide, please. And so the summer results. So I basically kept my class the same for the summer. And some of the cons are sometimes we don't really want to see everything on a student's camera. So they don't always realize what's going on behind them. And I actually had one student that was asleep during class. But you know, I think keeping them on camera is a good thing overall. Uploading on my recordings onto the YouTube was often very slow, and I'm curious about the proprietary information with the CSU and accessibility on YouTube when the institution owns our lectures. So how does that work with YouTube? And then I couldn't write on the PowerPoints anymore when I was doing it this other way. So I'm going to try the Zoom whiteboard feature to see if I can write on a PowerPoint if I have one. The pros for my summer results were I had much better resolution. I shared my screens for the PowerPoints, which worked fine. And I had great student engagement. By having them on the camera, I actually asked them, interrupt me, because you can't raise your hand per se, right? So feel free to say, Aparna, I have a question. I'll be okay with that. And opening myself up to that allowed them to ask lots of questions during class. And I feel that synchronicity is a key, especially for a class like genetics and advanced cell biology, but also I think it really helps the students to have a schedule. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So with more experience, I hope to have a series of much better videos after the fall. Next slide, please. Okay, another item that I'm adding to my genetics class is a mini cure so that students can actually do a little bit of research in the middle of that class. So they'll be able to do some hands-on work. This mini cure will allow them to learn about how to use reference genomes, do a literature review, simple data mining, and investigate a disorder that I provide to them or that they find that they are interested in. I think it will enhance their interest in the class, but also it scaffolds on top of a mini cure that one of my colleagues developed, Simon Titan, for our introductory biology class. So we're working to scaffold, and I think this will help. Next. Next slide, please. So what did I learn? I think that during this time, we really need to up the ante. So more office hours really help students, providing the videos immediately after the class, as soon as you can, onto your site. Zoom breakout rooms work really well for problem solving sessions, putting students in little groups, having them do a couple of the problem solving pieces, coming back to the big group and presenting that. Again, engagement. Also providing as many external resources as we can on our systems, and encouraging students to ask questions. It's okay to interrupt because I'm online, I may not see all of you, so please, just say, Aparna, I have a question. I really like student cameras to be on unless there's a bandwidth problem or some kind of issue at home that they can't do it, and that's okay. Open note exams, but maintaining a time. And the synchronous teaching, I really feel like that keeps the students engaged and could help to relieve some depression and anxiety of not having that set schedule that they're really used to. And then after class, after Zoom really, really helped to have some of them open up, which I think they may have needed to do. Next slide, please. So what do I still need? I need to project better. I need to realize that I can only use boring colors like black and blue so that they can all see everything I'm writing on the board. I need additional lighting. My husband's a photographer and he wanted to put a huge light in front of me, and I kept saying no, but really if I have a huge light in front of me, it's going to project everything that I'm doing better. So I'm going to listen to him finally. A larger whiteboard would be great. And I just purchased a Wi-Fi extender to ensure that while my kids at home are online, that I will not get kicked offline. So I think that those are some important things. And our dean's office has assisted in paying for some of these items for us. So that has been very helpful. Next slide, please. So I want to now move over, and so I've given you my anecdotal evidence, right? This is just my experience and what I changed. But now I want to show you some data from CSUMB's Undergraduate Research Opportunities Center and Office of Inclusive Excellence. They conducted a survey that was based on the EduCast survey, and they did this at the end of the spring semester. 45% of the respondents of this survey were students of color. 47% were Pell eligible, and 52% were first generation. Next slide, please. And so I'll just share a couple of the questions with you and some of the key findings. So to what degree have the following learning educational issues been a challenge for you since the transition to remote learning? Well, personal preference to face-to-face learning was top, of course, and that's good in some ways. I tell my son, now you're going to be happy to go back to school, right? Difficulty focusing or paying attention to remote instruction or activities. This is where that's why I feel like synchronicity can be key, because if they're there at the same time, that might help. And then personal motivation and desire to complete coursework. So that discussion with them afterward, trying to keep them motivated, reminding them what this is all about when they feel like, as Christine mentioned, they're experiencing depression, they're experiencing anxiety. So how can we help alleviate that to get their motivation levels up? Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Yeah, so to what degree have each of the following technological issues been a challenge for them? And so again, this is on a scale of 1, not at all, to 3, a great deal. And you'll see that it doesn't equal 100%. That's because the not at all category is what's missing. And so instructor discomfort or lack of familiarity with required technologies. So this makes sense because this survey occurred after spring, and we were all flipping very quickly to change into what we thought would be a good online modality. And many of us have had to make big changes. So hopefully this will shift in the fall as faculty have gone through many different iterations of what they're doing. access to reliable internet and service. I believe that CSUMB is trying to help students out by providing some hotspots and et cetera for them, and hopefully other CSUs are able to do the same and other institutions. But this is a real concern, right? Because students need to be able to have reliable internet to do this and even appear synchronously. So that's part of the problem, right? Asking them to do that. And then access to library resources. And so that hopefully will change in the fall. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. To what degree have the following environmental related issues been challenging for you? And so this made me happy because it actually coincided with what I was finding just anecdotally, right? So not being able to keep a regular schedule was very challenging for 85% of these students. And so that's where the synchronicity really comes into play, having them keep a schedule. And I also talked to them a lot about, okay, in the morning I get up and I exercise first thing, even though I could sleep in right now, but I get up the same time I usually always did, go and do my exercise and then get ready for my day. And so kind of like as Christine mentioned, the modeling piece, right? Showing them, they know my children sometimes show up on the video, or I have to, tell them, okay, you need to just wait a second and I'll be right there to my children versus my students. But they can also see that I'm being interrupted. I'm trying to deal with it in the best way possible. Not having a quiet place to study, 82%. This is a hard one, right? How do we help them with that? I've had many students talk to me about not having to just be quiet, and maybe earphones, maybe something else. Family or roommate expectations of having to help at home. Now that you're at home, why can't you do the vacuuming? Why can't you do this? And they're actually in school. And I've had many students even talk to me about this as well. So it was really helpful for me to see that at least my anecdotal evidence coincides with this, so that what I was thinking I was seeing is most likely real, right? Next slide. Slide, please. Okay, so how helpful were the actions that CSUMB faculty took to transition to online instruction? So flexible with course deadlines, postponed deadlines, allowed safe late submissions. I did that on a case-to-case basis. And again, I teach upper division courses. So my students are already kind of there when it comes to meeting deadlines. However, if there was some kind of major issue that came up, of course, I would take that into consideration. Flexible with course requirements. I was not flexible with my course requirements, but it looks like students thought that that was an important thing. However, again, that was from in spring. So we'll see how things go in fall as students are more used to this kind of online modality. And communicated consistently, sent out frequent email updates. I was emailing students all the time. However, I did set some boundaries. I did tell them, I am not going to respond to you at I will be sleeping. Because, I'm almost 50, so I go to sleep at 10 o'clock at night and I wake up at 6 in the morning. It's always the same, and so they knew when I would not be available. But I did tell them that between 8 and 10 hours after they email, they will get a response from me. I also made course content much more accessible, many more videos, many more resources, and I made myself more available. I held something seemed urgent. So this was nice to see. Again, it sort of coincided with the way that I was seeing things. Next slide, please. And so I just want to thank my students and the CSUMB College of Science, the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Center, the Office of Inclusive Excellence, and Dr. Bianca Mothe for give this talk. And I really enjoyed hearing what Christine had to say. And I like the way that our thoughts are going together. So because you have the expertise in psychology, so it's really nice to see that. And so if there are any questions, I'm sure we would be happy to take them at this.
Okay, so I am scanning the chat box. So first, thank you, Aparna and Christine. This was wonderful. And, we talk about this as an opportunity to, really fine tune or integrate some additional elements to your course as you're getting ready to go into fall semester. So I'm going through, I see a question around are there any contact at CSU or each campus we can send the students who suffer trauma? So my initial reaction to that is your student affair colleagues and counseling, but I wanted to see if Christine had any more specific information on that one.
Yeah, I think CSU specific, it would be the counseling centers at each CSU. And I imagine they're also doing like virtual sessions. Unfortunately, it's limited to many campuses limit the amount of sessions that one gets. I think it's like maybe 4 to 6, depending. I think our campus provides 6 a semester. But I would say that would be the first place to go. And then in terms of other places, there's, yes, community centers and things like that. But I would point them to the Psychological Services Center.
So I wanted to reconcile some elements that I saw from the 2 different talks in terms of being flexible enough with your students. And I like how Aparna mentioned like the synchronicity in terms of being able to provide that engagement, but then also recording the content and making that available later. And I wanted to open that back up to Aparna and Christine to see if they had any additional comments around that in terms of advice for faculty going into fall. And is the synchronicity unique because we need to push out so much content in the sciences that we need those students to sort of process with others? Or, you know, recording and then going back to it later, is that sufficient? So I'm just trying to get a hold because we see some varying recommendations through that.
I think that, you know, it seems like flexibility for us is key. You know, I like to require that synchronicity, but of course, when there are students that have they can, you know, they have things that are going to interfere with that synchronicity, I'm flexible. That's why there's a video on there all the time, right? So that they can actually go back to the video if they have to leave you know, for some reason or another. I noted in the chat that many people were saying, you know, having them to have the camera on is a privacy issue. Totally agree with that. It's just that, and students can not have their camera on. I just ask them, can you please have your camera on, right? And so if they don't have it, there's no penalty for not having a camera on. And students do choose to turn them on and off at will, depending on what's going on in their background. But yeah, I feel like with my courses, because they're upper division as well, that having them there while I'm teaching that and being able to ask me questions during the actual process of the teaching helps them with their learning process. And that's just, but I think it's philosophically, you know, what's right and what's wrong is really difficult right now. And so I think I'm just sharing the things that worked for me and with my students. But a lower division intro bio class would be really, really different, right? Because they have 120 students versus the 24 I had in the summer genetics class and the 40 I had in the other class that I was teaching. So that also will make a big difference in terms of how we do things.
And I like the idea about having a set time and a structure. I really do appreciate that because I think that helps mitigate any depression as well. And so I also think it depends on the class you're teaching. The class I taught in the summer seemed like a reasonable class to just have them read through the content and not have to meet, because it's not like I'm teaching them complex like mathematical problems or like science, right? Like I'm not doing the type of bioscience that you guys are. And so I do think it depends on the class. It's challenging though when students don't have their own structured schedule because like their work is having them come in at odd hours, or like they're trying to pick up shifts here and there to pay their bills. And so I think it's important to give them the choice, right? Like maybe you do set aside time throughout the week to have a certain date and time that you're doing the class online, and have those who are able to come, and then have the recording so you could post it online for those who weren't able to make it so they could see it afterwards. And then they can kind of pick and choose, you know, based on what other stuff is going on in their life, which ones they need to attend based on their own learning style and what concepts are challenging for them. Like maybe they would make science a priority and make another class one that they wouldn't attend. So that goes back to that authentic choice, right? And there was something else I was going to say about that. I'm blanking right now. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is, as a clinical psychologist, I'm also doing therapy online. So I have full days where I'm on the computer sitting in front of a camera talking to people, right? And I just think from the student perspective, you know, it was different when they would go to class in a classroom and sit there and go to their next class. Like that changed things up. But if they're sitting in front of a screen for 6 hours a day, I can't imagine what that would be like as a student. So that's just something to consider too. Like they're taking a lot more classes than we're teaching, right? And we have one class that we have to teach, but they're taking maybe 4 or 5 classes. So it's just, it's a challenge. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think we're just trying to figure out what's best. But I think as long as you can offer choices, that can help students in the long run.
Yeah, on that note, I did have one additional question that was around, and it came to me specifically, and it's a faculty member asking, I have a graduate class from 6 to 9 p.m. and another senior class from 6 to 8 p.m. And, you know, how do I create this so it's not too long for them to attend? So just thinking about Zoom fatigue and creating those breaks or creating breakout rooms so students can then engage and be more active. I wanted to kind of follow up on what Christine's mentioning, like we're all suffering Zoom fatigue, and just remember that our students are going to be coming on here pretty soon and having to do this through all of their classes. So what elements of Zoom fatigue are they experiencing as well, especially for these multi-hour classes? So with that, it is past 11. If you all need to leave, that's okay. And if the presenters, if we could stay on for a couple more minutes and see, I scan the chat room. But again, I wanted to thank Aparna and Christine. And some follow-ups is that we will share this recording. And Aparna and Christine, I want to make sure it was okay to also share the slides.
Thank you very much, Bianca, Christina, and Aparna.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Trying to see if there are any other questions that maybe we haven't talked about. I see the question of Wi-Fi and access. I think, yeah, I see there's the, on our campus, I just saw an email message at San Marcos that came out yesterday that multiple parking lots are going to have free parking in the fall for students, so that students can come in and park in those lots and hopefully have access to Wi-Fi while they're there. So I wanted to mention that San Marcos is going to do that. I don't know if some other campuses are going to do that as well to help respond to students. I'm not sure about the library situation. I haven't heard yet an update on my campus's library for fall.
I feel like I heard something in a meeting 2 days ago about CSUMB providing some sorts of hotspots like that for students as well. So I'm hopeful about that. So that might be helpful for the students who really have poor spotty Wi-Fi. Also, students that live on our campus, I believe, Christine, right? The Wi-Fi is free. The Comcast is free on our campus. So when they live there, they have it, but it's not always the best bandwidth, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other unique question that I see that maybe we haven't talked about is the HFlex class model. Is anyone transitioning to a high flex class model? And I'm assuming hybrid mode. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for staying on. I know we had a few participants that stayed on past 11. We are officially done. And thank you again, Aparna and Christine. You guys were awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Did you want us to stay on, Bianca, or are you good?
I want to thank you, and any feedback for us?